Okay, so we're continuing on our videos on items. This is hopefully going to be the last one. And this video we're going to talk about how to actually use items, how to do certain things when we use items. So I have here 4 different examples. We have Apple, Sword, EXP, and Speed Potion. And so we're going to go over quick examples on how to configure them and how to make node graphs for them. So just to start off, every item has the ability to have a node graph attached to it. And so how this works is you see here the associated item node graph. You can click on here and you can choose an item node graph. And now this is a little different because if you go into the node graph explorer, you see that there are categories here. We have entity node graphs, status, class, and item node graphs. And so only items in the item node graph folder can be attached to items, whereas entity node graphs can be attached to entities, and similarly with class and status. So just make sure that you're aware of this little gotcha, because even though the same nodes can be put into any server node graph, regardless of where it's located, you can only use item node graphs for items. Okay, so just be aware of that. So you see here that I created different item node graphs for Apple, EXP, and so forth. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example here. Let's go ahead and look at Apple item. So this is the node graph that gets attached to the Apple, and it runs whenever I use it, right? Because here it says when inventory item is used, this is the event that the item listens for. Now, you can't use this node graph on the character. So for example, if you make an entity node graph, and inside one of these node graphs you use this event, it's actually not going to work. Even if I use an item, only items are allowed to listen to this event. So just keep that in mind. So when I use the Apple, it's going to call this event. And so what I'm doing here is I'm checking the item config ID to make sure that it's the same config ID as the Apple. And then if this is true, I'm going to recover some HP directly using this node. And just for example's sakes, what I do here is I take the amount of apples that are used, because inside of here, inside the interaction settings, I allow bulk use. So what this means is that the player can use the item, let's say like 5 at a time or 10 at a time, whatever they pick. So in the amount used, this might be 1 or this might be 10. And so I want each apple to restore 100 health. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this amount used, I'm going to multiply by 100. And so I'm converting this into a float, because actually the amount used is going to be an integer. And so the result is also going to be an integer. So I'm converting it into a float because if you just take a look here, the recovery amount requires a floating point number. I can't just pass in the integer value here. So I convert it to a float and put that in there. And so this is going to take all the apples that were used. And so it's important to use an item config ID here. This is just for example. For my specific use case, this doesn't really matter since this is only attached to one item, which is the Apple. But let's say, for example, this wasn't an Apple item, this was a food item node graph. And so it can actually be attached to all sorts of food items. And so here what I would do is I would check if it's an Apple, and if it's true, then I would, amount used is multiplied by 100. But if, for example, it's not this Apple config ID, then what I can do is do another double branch. And for the condition, I can check for, let's say, another type of food item with its own config ID, right? So I pass the config ID in here. I'll check, let's say, I'm just making up config IDs, but let's just say this was some kind of, I don't know, carrot or something, right? And so if it's a carrot, then I'll basically do the same logic where I'm taking this data here, the amount used, and let's say instead of 100 I want to multiply it by 75 and then do the same recover HP directly, right? So what you're doing here is, let's say this food item node graph is attached to many different food items, and so you want to do different things based on what item is used. Now the best practice here is to actually just make different item node graphs for each item. You don't really want to generalize unless you kind of know what you're doing. So in my case, it's good to do Apple item and then carrot item specific node graphs. And so what I can do is just keep it like this, and we have a nice node graph that just recovers HP. And so back in the editor, just make sure that the Apple item node graph is attached to this item. And here in the game, just as an example, you see that I have low HP, or not low HP, but I've lost some HP. So if I go ahead and use some apples here, I can choose 5, let's say. And so this is going to regenerate 500 HP. And there we go. We got our HP back, right? Some of it. Okay, so that was a pretty simple example. Similar logic will be used for something like EXP items. Now in my case here, I have in the interaction settings, it's going to be used automatically on pickup. So if I buy, for example, 10 of these items from the shop, it's just going to be used right away. And so the same logic applies. If we take a look at the EXP item, you can see that it more or less resembles what we had with the Apple item. I'm just checking to make sure what item is actually being used, and then I'm getting the player entity. I'm multiplying based on what the value is of, for example, how much XP I want to gain. And so if I use 5, then I'm multiplying by 5 and I'm changing the player's current class by 25 levels, right? And so again, this is kind of important to check what EXP item I'm using. If, for example, I have 3 different EXP items and then one item gives me 5 EXP, another will give me 10, another will give me 1. And so actually in this case, just as a pro tip, you probably don't want to keep doing these conditional branches. What you want to do instead is go over here and go to Advanced Data Management and create a structure. And in here you can do, for example, EXP items and create a dictionary. Now this is all explained in one of my previous videos, but if you just make a dictionary, what you can do is you can set a configuration ID to an integer. And so the configuration IDs will be your EXP items, and then the how much XP they map to, how much XP they give will be put here. So in this case, what I could do is I could apply this, and let's just say that I had the correct values in here. Then back in the node graph, instead of doing a multiplication and doing a check, what I could do is I could get my structure, make sure I select EXP items, and then I can query the dictionary by the key, and then the key here would just be the item config ID. And so this will return for me an integer, which I can plug into here, or of course, multiply it first by however many EXP items was used. And so it's basically going to look something like this, right? When the inventory item is used, I'll get my EXP item dictionary, which maps the EXP item to the amount of XP to gain. And then I'll multiply it by whatever the value is based on how many are used. And then I'll pass this in and change the current level of the character, right? Or of the player. And so when you do something like this, you can actually make multiple EXP items with different amounts of EXP that it offers the player. And something like this will work just fine. Now that example just kind of sets the EXP of the player instead of adding to it properly. So I went ahead and just made a quick demo of how you would add to the player's XP. So in here, when the item is used, you would go ahead and do your multiplication for how much EXP to gain, and then you would query the player class level by getting the player's class and the player entity, and then you'll add the level that the player currently has with the new value that you want to give, and then you'll set the player's current value to whatever this new result is. And so if we look at the player template, you'll see that the initial level is going to be 20. So when we start the game, it should actually be 25. And there we go, 25. And actually, let's go ahead and just test this out by buying some items from the shop. So I can go ahead and buy, let's say, 10, which should give me 50 levels. And now we're at level 75. Perfect. Very good. Now moving on to the speed potion, I'm going to do the sword last just because it's a little bit complicated than the regular items. But for the speed potion, obviously what we want is when we use the speed potion to get a speed buff. And so how do we manage buffs and speed buffs? We use unit statuses. And so I went ahead and created a speed boost unit status. I gave it a duration of 5 seconds, and the effect is just giving a 40% increase in movement speed. Now on the item itself, I added the speed potion item node graph. And if we just take a look at it, we see here same thing. When the inventory item is used, we'll go ahead and check if it's the speed potion. If it is, we'll add the unit status where I put in the config ID of the speed boost. Give it a 1 stack. Doesn't really matter how many stacks I give it. But for the applier entity and target entity is basically just the owner of the item, which is the character that used it. So we'll just pass it in here. And again, this is a redundant check unless you have multiple potions that you put this on. And so instead of a speed potion node graph, it'll just be potion or potion item node graph, something like that. You could use the same logic with the EXP item by making a structure that maps a certain item to a status configuration ID. So definitely if you want to experiment with that, go ahead. But let's go ahead and test this out. So I'm going to use the speed potion from my inventory. And then you can see I'm running around really fast. And then after 5 seconds, I should slow down, and there we go, we're back to normal speed. Now finally, for the actual weapons, the things that you can equip, this is a little bit different. So let me show you why this is so different. For the sword, I added the sword item node graph, and if we just take a look at it, you'll see here that I have 2 events. I have when the equipment is equipped and when it is unequipped. And they basically do the same thing, the same checks, but what happens here is we'll add a unit status and then we'll remove it when it's unequipped, right? And so the unit status is just this one right here, attack boost, where I give myself an attack boost of 300% and then I give this little buff effect. Now, if we go ahead and try this, this will actually work. This will work just fine. You can see here that if I attack this dummy here, it does 500 damage, but then when I equip the sword, it's actually going to do 2000 damage. And so you can see that the buff works. We even have the effects playing on the character. But one of the cool things about equipable items is that you don't have to manage these buffs through node graphs, because it's kind of tedious to have to constantly check for when the item is equipped or unequipped. And so instead, what Miliastra's editor allows is for, if we go ahead into the manage equipment data here, we see here that there are affixes that we can add. And so affixes are basically these little adjustments. I explained this in my previous video on items, but basically they just give us some kind of status or adjustment that we can apply to the character whenever they equip some kind of equipable item. So let's go ahead and add an affix, and here we'll give it like attack boost. And so what happens here is you'll see it says attack boost _1, and this is because I already have a unit status called attack boost, and you can't have the same affix and unit status name because they're kind of like in the same category. So you'll see this _1, and this is fine, it doesn't really matter. But basically you'll see here effective timing when we equip our weapon, because this is what I want it to do. I want it to only work when we equip the weapon. Then in here what we can do is apply a unit status, and then we'll click which one we want. Well, I already made this one in here, attack boost. We'll put in how many stacks we want. In my case, 1 is fine, it doesn't really matter. These bonus types and bonus value options here don't apply to us because we're not applying an attribute bonus to the character. We're just doing a unit status. And so the beauty of this is that even though my unit status actually has an infinite duration, when I equip the weapon, it's going to add this unit status, but when I unequip it, it's going to automatically unequip it for me, so that this infinite duration, it doesn't really matter. It's just basically here to say that while the equipment is equipped, this attack boost should work, right? Should be active. But then when I unequip it, the game is going to automatically unequip this attack boost as well. And so basically it's doing the same thing that this node graph is doing. It's just you don't have to make this node graph for it to work. You don't have to go through the hassle of this. So you could, if you want some kind of like really precise control, this is how you would do it. You would use these events when equipment is equipped. You would query the config ID of the equipment index and check to make sure which one it is. And then if you have some kind of special configurations that you need to run, maybe you have to update a variable, then you would do it here. But for just the unit statuses where you want like a buff because you equipped a sword, or maybe you equipped like a better sword, then you don't have to rely on node graphs for that. You can instead just specify what kind of affixes you want on the weapon. Now we have to actually go to the weapon here. So let's go ahead into our sword. And in the interaction settings, you'll see here that initial affixes, we have to add it so that we know which ones to apply for this specific weapon. So if we go to add affix and we go to attack boost here, and let's go ahead and remove this sword item node graph. We don't need it, so I'm just gonna remove node graph like this. We're gonna save it. And now if I go ahead and equip the sword, you see that once again, we have these effects. I do 2000 damage. And now when I unequip it, you can see that the effect goes away and I'm back to doing 500. And so that's basically the gist of working with items. Unfortunately, with item node graphs, you can't apply or use any node graph variables like you would on entities. So this is kind of like a little limitation where you have to either make a specific node graph for that item to work a specific way, or you can go my route, the way that I like to do it, and create structures. And then inside the node graph, you will work with these structures to figure out what effect to apply to what item that was being used. And so each item, so for example, every food item in my game would just get the food item node graph, and then the node graph will figure out what effects or statuses or things to change or apply using the structure, using a dictionary to see what configuration ID, what item maps to what unit status or change in value, whatever it is that I put here. And one more thing to note is that equipable items actually have this extra tag and affixes that you can put on them, but you can't do this with normal items, right? If I go to the interaction settings, you see that it's not here, it's not an option. So you can't actually add affixes to usable items. You can only do it on equipable items. So just make sure you understand that little discrepancy. If this video helped you out, please make sure to subscribe and like. I'm really trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. Really appreciate all the support lately. And if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments.